In this lesson, we will continue to paint in the sphere. First of all, we want to set up our layers a little bit further. In the background, let's lock the position. In the table, we should lock the position. And on the sphere, we want to lock the position and the transparency. These buttons up here control all the locking. If you want to lock everything, you hit that button. This button here prevents you from painting on this layer. I want to demonstrate why we need the lock transparency for this layer, since we're going to be painting in just the sphere. What this does is forces the brush only to paint on the pixels that are opaque, or to the degree the pixels are opaque on the layer. In our case, we painted it in opaquely at 20%, so there's when we put this button on, we won't be able to paint on it. I'll demonstrate that. For example, I've got a brush, and if I paint on there, we see it also paints onto the background. I'm going to Control Z to get rid of that. But if we lock transparency, it only paints on the pixels that are on the layer. If I turn that off, you can see it's just masked to the object. Hit Control Z a couple times. Okay, now go to your brushes, your tool presets. Oh, somehow this got messed up. Hang on. Pull this down. Actually, what I can do is go to Window, Workspace, and reload the workspace. There we go. Okay, this brush here is a soft round brush at 25%. We're going to want to pick a value. We're going to be painting the sphere in grayscale at the moment, and later we'll be painting with color. It's a lot like when artists use underpainting and just paint in the Grizzle, which is the black and white version of the painting, and then later they put glazes to make color. So we're going to use a similar idea in separating value from color. I don't think I'm going to want to be at 60% gray to paint, but my brush needs to be a lot bigger. If you have a Wacom tablet or the Wacom Cintiq, you can set the scroll bars on the side or on the left side to allow you to make your brush bigger and smaller. If you don't have it set up this way, then you can use the bracket key to make it go larger and smaller. Or if you're using a mouse or haven't set this up yet, you could go and use your brush controls up here and change the pixel size that way. On the top here we have some brush controls or tool controls, and for the most part we want to leave the mode at normal. If I don't specify a mode for the brush, it's usually normal. The opacity slider can be used. Again, there are other ways within the Wacom system to control this. We're going to leave flow alone and just use the opacity. I'll reset my opacity at 25% using Wacom's radial palette, which I can bring up with my mouse button. So hit opacity 25. But we're going to need our brush quite a bit larger, somewhere around 400. We might also have to change our opacity. But let's get started with trying to shade in the sphere. Going into layers, I would turn off the table layer just so that we can see the sphere shape, the circle disc, without any disruption around its edges. We could go to transparency, but I think that's much harder on the eyes. I have some other documents here I'd like to show you. This is sort of what we're aiming for. We're going to light our sphere from the upper left because that's easiest for a right-handed artist. If you're left-handed, you want to probably try it doing the other way. We're going to have a highlight, a mid-tone, a core shadow, and a reflected light. We do this by painting on the sphere either with lighter tones or darker tones to create this. I have another document to show you, giving you some idea of some of the principles involved with shading in a sphere or any other curved object. And this is being lit pretty much in the same way as we were expecting to do our final version. But we faceted it so that we can see that each of these rings is about the same value. So up here we have our highlight, our midtones, and our core shadow. This is somewhat posterized, and obviously when we do a more realistic version, we want very soft edges on all these aspects. And down here is a little lighter, and that's the reflected light coming off the surface of our table bouncing back in. One thing to note is that each ring has the same value. And that's the least change that we have on the surface. Each one of these rings is perpendicular to the direction of light. On the other hand, if we look at the paths of light and changing of gradation across the sphere this way, it has to change very much over the whole distance. It's going to keep changing. So it's a gradation. So when you're painting with these techniques, you want to follow the form perpendicular to the direction of the light, because otherwise it's much easier to lay down these even bands than it would be to try to using pressure or some other technique to create the gradations that happen parallel with the light. So let's go back to the sphere, and keeping those things in mind, we will start to paint in the sphere. Again, I'm going to bring my brush up, and I'm just going to try out and see how it's going to go. Going back to my layers, making sure that the transparency is on, and I'm going to start by defining where the core shadow would be, like this. Now we're very soft. We might even want to be lower opacity. So again, I could go up here and even be lower. We're going to consider that the value that we started with on the sphere is the midtones. Now we can go over here and set a secondary color. Over here we have a little arrow that switches back from the primary to the secondary color. And on this we have a white, and that's going to be for our lights, and that's our darks. So we can switch these back and forth by pushing on this little arrow, or we can just use the X key. So here I am with a dark, doing a core shadow, and here I am with the light trying to start the highlights. So going back and forth from using, you can see it much more effective to go around the sphere than it would be to do this. I'm going to Control Z that. So I'm just leaving this little area here as our reflected light. I want to get my core shadow darker. How far you go with the contrast between the light and the dark is a subject that would have to be discussed separately, but it all has to do with the lighting conditions and the value that the local value and color of the sphere. Again, I'm going to use X, go back to the white, put a little bit more highlight in. This is a very diffused surface, so the light is scattering off the surface. Go back to our brush, and if we want to erase, what we should do is use a third color, which was our original 20%. If you notice here, my core shadow is a little too far up on the side, so I'm going to get the mid-tone value, which is 30%, making sure I got 30%, and now I'm going to draw and paint in along, trying to move the core shadow down more. Now we need to go back and set up with white and 60% again. So now I'm at 60%, and I'm going to try to get the core shadow to really be at the right angle. The light's coming from here, pushing down. My reflected light's a little bit bright, so I'm going to take it down a little. Try to go sweep all the way around it. If you stab at it like this, it starts to look uneven. Again, I want to bring up just a little bit more along the edge, softening it just a bit. Need a very large one to do it. All right. Now get my white out and make sure that my gradation from the highlight's good. Okay. I'm pretty happy with the sphere. We can look at the one I did before. I think it's a little bit better than that. This has a little bit too much dark up here. Again, talking about the shading of a sphere, and pretty much most of the shading of other objects, we have what we know as the core shadow line. This is what defines the area of the object that's been hit by the light from our light source, our primary light source, and does not receive any light directly from the primary light or the key light. And that's true of pretty much anything you draw and paint, is that there will be an edge that'll define between the lights and the darks, and it's the core shadow. Then there usually is a little bit of a reflected light. If you overdo the reflected light down here, it will look strange. It won't look three-dimensional.